Hi, Matt Hopper here, in the city of Kingston upon Hull, where I was born and where I may well die. Who knows? So I turned 50 this year and it's freaking me out a bit. My youth is a long way behind me and I don't really feel like I've achieved anything. So I thought I'd waste some more time and make a video about my relationship with Joy Division and the way their music affected me and accompanied me on my journey into oblivion. But I thought it'd be good to set the scene first. The world I was born into in 1970 had no video games, no home computers, no role-playing games, no Star Wars, and no punk, unless you count the Stooges and all that stuff. There were no phone masts on every other street, there were 240 pennies to the pound, and the Vietnam War was still a thing. As a child I watched all the war films of the day, and Action Man became my favourite toy. I always thought the Germans had the coolest outfits, but I'm not a Nazi, honest. I looked to heroes in film, comics, literature and music, and imagined other ways of living. I wanted to escape the ordinariness of the city, but I never did, not physically at least. In 1978, Space Invaders was released, and I saw Star Wars. From then on, arcade games and Star Wars would gradually replace my other interests. By the time I was 11, I was becoming more interested in music. The first album I bought was Kings of the Wild Frontier by Adam and the Ants. I still love that album, and as a kid I thought their image was fantastic. Around this time I also got into the metal bands of the time, Judas Priest, Motorhead and Saxon. Iron Maiden's Number of the Beast was the second album I remember buying. Songs about Saxon warriors and satanic rituals. My mind was blown. This was also the time I first discovered role-playing games. My brother bought the Dungeons and Dragons starter set in about 1982, but I was kinda disappointed by it. I'd hoped it'd be filled with LED fantasy miniatures, but instead there were just a couple of books and some dice. Around this time I got my first computer, a Sinclair ZX81. It was crap and I hardly used it. A year later I got a ZX Spectrum, which was miles better. I even managed to write a few crappy games in BASIC, but that's for another video. Maybe. Probably not. Like many of my generation, I tried my hand at breakdancing and began to wear expensive label clothes like Fila, Ticini, Lacoste. I even invested in my own Ghetto Blaster, a crappy Sideshow Dixon's own brand piece of crap. Ironic because not long after I ended up working there. My school years ended with a fizzle and I drifted into my first job, a salesperson at Dixon's Limited, the high street electrical retailer. This was a mistake. I wish I could travel back to my 17-year-old self and whisper, "Don't do it." I was young for my age and wasn't really ready for such an environment. The manager, Doug, was an archetypal 80s yuppie, blue framed glasses and a Filofax. He was a total bastard and he really didn't like me. He made my time there extremely unpleasant. This gave me a chip on my shoulder and a skewed worldview that stayed with me for a long time. But it was around this time that I first remember hearing Joy Division. It was an ordinary, dreary 1980s morning, about 8:45 AM, and I was in Dad's car on my way to work. The radio was playing the usual tunes of the day, until a song came on that stood out. The singer was crooning, his voice deep and mournful. The bass line followed the melody, which was almost childlike in its simplicity. The synthesizer washes told me it was contemporary, but it somehow seemed out of time and place. The song was atmosphere, and it fit perfectly with how I was feeling. I went to work, and another unspectacular day disappeared into obscurity. But that moment from my youth has stuck with me all these years. I suppose in some ways it changed my life forever. About a year later, I was on holiday with my family in Looe, Cornwall, and we went for a drive to Plymouth for the day. I went into a record store and Joy Division's Substance had just been released. I felt drawn to it and I bought it. The name Joy Division had a strange enigmatic magic to it. When I first listened, their music was hard for my ears to digest, but I recognised atmosphere from that day. Ian's voice was deep, sad, angry. His words were poetic, but very inward-looking and always cryptic. Ian was affirming a feeling that I had, that existence was a mysterious business, and that just being was an exciting phenomenon. I remember around this time, I had a sense that there was a different world out there to the one we were brought up to believe in. There was another layer to life that I wanted to explore, something inside me, I wasn't sure what it was. I'd feel it when I read something like Alan Moore's Watchmen, which had just been released, or a few years earlier watching Herne the Hunter emerge from the trees to address Michael Praed's enigmatic Robin of Sherwood. Mystery and magic. Joy Division were the same. Ian was inspired by his heroes, he was channeling them and wanted to experience a slice of their greatness. The creative process and music represent that quest to give your life meaning. That's how you escape. I think the next album of theirs I got was Still. My friend Pat bought it, but I don't think he liked it and he left it at mine. There were 2 cassettes and they came in a real cool purple canvas box. No idea where those tapes ended up. They're quite collectible now. After that I got Unknown Pleasures. It surprised me as it sounded quite different to the other stuff I'd heard. More distant and spacey. The production was less crisp and it seemed to evoke the 70s. The songs had originally begun life as punk songs, but Martin Hannett's production turned them into something else. This, more than anything I'd heard so far, sounded like how it felt to be living in Hull in 1989. Today when I listen to Unknown Pleasures, it reminds me of Christmas Day 1989. The family were relaxing after a busy day, munching on leftovers and watching TV. I cycled out to find a party I'd heard about. I didn't find it, and I came home and everyone had gone to bed. I was listening to Unknown Pleasures and everything felt different. Christmas has always been a special time for me, but something had changed. These were the last few days of the 80s and my world was changing quickly. Andy Rowe, a local photographer, recently uploaded a picture of me at this time. It was strange that it should turn up just as I was making this film. The picture was so vivid, it was like looking through time. I stared at it for quite a while. I felt as though I was there, in that moment again, with all my crazy ideas and dreams. At this time, Joy Division themselves were an enigmatic band. All I knew at the time was that Ian Curtis had killed himself and that the band had evolved into New Order. There was a definite air of mystery about them, a riddle I had to solve. I got hold of a book about them, an ideal for living, but this only added to the enigma. There was no comment on the nature of the events that led to Ian's death, besides an obscure comment about a series of tragic circumstances. I'll read the paragraph. Joy Division was on the verge of achieving the goal which they had set almost 3 years earlier, but on the eve of their tour and due to an unusual combination of personal circumstances best left unexplored, Ian Curtis committed suicide at his home in Macclesfield. Speculation is not only futile, but also an invasion of his privacy. Suffice it to say that melancholy had not been a dominant factor in his personality, and his life had been relatively happy and punctuated with some practical jokes of his best left untold. Possibly Chris Bonn of NME summed it up as well as anyone when he said, 17th October 1981, that May 18th, 1980 didn't so much bring Joy Division's journey to the heart of darkness to an abrupt halt as freeze it for all eternity at the brink of discovery. At least we can still travel that far with them. That was all I knew for years, and in some ways I wish it had remained that way. So that brings us to 1990. Goodbye 1980s, I miss you and I'll always love you. The world is a very different place. Electronic dance music and rave is king, and Manchester, Joy Division's home, is more psychedelic than goth. Bands like Happy Mondays and Spiral Carpets and Stone Roses are on the rise. The rave scene completely passes me by. I don't like drugs and I despise crowds. This is when the universe delivers the final piece of the puzzle. I think it was my girlfriend Ruth who bought or gave me a copy of Closer. This was Joy Division's final album and was released just after Ian had died. It's very heavy and dark and has been described as an extended suicide note. It's way more crisp in production than Unknown Pleasures, with less subtle layers of synth and reverb. For me personally, it will always be the sound of 1990. I had some kind of breakdown which included crippling panic attacks. I retreated, becoming more and more of a hermit, drifting away from friends and from life in general, I guess. I was studying art at college, but I had to drop out as my anxiety attacks became unbearable. I'd eventually recover enough to return to my studies, but this wouldn't be until I was in my 40s, 20 years later, which strangely would bring me closer to Joy Division's story than I could ever have imagined. But back to my early 20s. I listened to Closer a lot. I became obsessed with songs like Isolation, and I loved Decades, which always reminds me of my grandparents and the horrors they were forced to go through, preventing them from fulfilling themselves and enjoying normal lives. I'd listen to this album when I felt most low. I always felt I was here for a reason, that there was something I had to do. I knew I'd get back on track. I started recording music. I wondered if I had similar greatness inside me. I worked hard at recording my tunes with limited technology, but it slowly dawned on me that it wasn't my medium, although I am fairly proud of a couple of those tracks. In the early 2000s, I learned that Ian's wife had written a book telling their story. I couldn't believe it. How come I hadn't heard about this? I got hold of a copy and all the mystery and speculation was stripped away. I hadn't even known about his affair with Anique and all the other details. It sounded so ordinary and tragic. That's life, I guess. In 2010, I enrolled again on an art course at Park Street, a local art and design school. I was still lacking in confidence after years of oblivion, but with the help of my tutors, I began to draw the ordinary surroundings of the council estate where I live. I think the monotone austerity of the images has something of Joy Division in them. Joy Division grew up in Manchester's suburbia, and all the iconic photos of them are in black and white. Then there's the crisp lines of Unknown Pleasure's cover art, and the gothic cover of Closer. So Joy Division have had a big effect on my life. I've often turned to their music through the years, and whether I was up or down, there was always something there. I guess I've missed out on a lot of stuff that life has to offer, a career, family and all that, and I've lived alone a lot of the time. But I've always felt that I had some creative potential that I had to realise somehow. In some ways it was probably the same for Joy Division. 4 lads in northern England who saw something more than the suburban drudgery that threatened to ensnare them. Day in, day out, day in, day out. Now I'm almost 50, I see them differently to when I was a kid. It's a whole different world now, and today our enemies are more spectral. Back then for me the enemy would have been the Tories or even just the boss at work. Now I see things very differently. The world has changed dramatically, or maybe I have. In this age of globalisation, of vain selfies and nihilistic materialism, every song ever recorded is accessible everywhere at any time, soon to be streamed from thousands of Elon's satellites or even from the transceivers in the lampposts. We're drowning in entertainment, in connectivity and surveillance. Joy Division and other bands of the time are still important to me, but not in the way they were when I was a tortured teen. The power and the darkness hidden inside all of us, that Ian channeled through his pen and onto his notebook, alone in his room in Macclesfield, seems at odds with the narcissistic quick fix of today's globally connected social media, the perfect antidote for our dead souls. So that's pretty much it, but there is one final quirk of fate that brought the band's story closer than I could ever have imagined. After I'd finished my studies at Park Street Art College in 2012, I began a fine art degree at the Hull School of Art and Design. I had more great tutors there and it went better than I could have imagined. I had some good times and I made some good work. Walking home one evening with Fraser, a friend I met on the course, I mentioned my love of Joy Division. "Oh," he said, "my uncle was Ian Curtis's best man at Ian's wedding." Huh? What? No way. I was gobsmacked, but 20 years earlier I would have exploded. I'd have seen it as a cosmic sign from the gods and confirmation of a great destiny. But at 42, I was too old and broken for all that self-mythologising bollocks. Magic ultimately loses to humdrum reality. Fraser's uncle came to see our degree show and I spoke with him a bit about my work. But I hardly said anything at all, and that bothers me. I'm not sure why. Somewhere inside me, I feel as though I shirked some responsibility I had to the world and to the past by not pushing myself out of my comfort zone and opening up. There's loads of crap I'd like to have talked about, but he was just a guy who lost his best mate years ago. Maybe that's all this story boils down to. Life can be tragic,